Welcome back to another episode of Make Me Data Literate. Once again, I've got a repeat guest this time, which we don't do very often, but I'm excited because the voting landscape has changed significantly, and I think it's made some really challenging changes to the data. So we're very exciting to welcome back Antony Green. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.
This is going to be fun. So I wanted to jump straight into it. I know that you're retired. You don't seem entirely retired, as far as I can tell. How does this sort of voting landscape make you feel? Like, why are you still doing this stuff?
Oh, I mean, I've just stepped away from doing television and the sort of having to do all the stuff I used to do at the ABC. I can sort of pick and choose what I do now, but I still have a big interest in the whole process, and it is becoming more complex. Maybe it's a good time to step away from it because it's become much more complex. The old models we used to use where you could predict with pretty good accuracy from early on, those are getting more complex to do because voting patterns are changing.
So that's exactly what I wanted to talk about, because you used to be able to rely on the fact that it would be in any given seat almost certainly a two-person race. You'd have two front runners. They might not always be Labor and LNP, but you'd only have to really work with two main contenders. That has broken down significantly, almost across the board. How does that change the work of psephology?
Well, it used to be that in every seat, you knew the two candidates beforehand. The two major party candidates would get 85% of the vote. There would be preferences from a small number of pool of votes, 15, 20%. But that's what the model was. And everything was very one-dimensional. You could do everything based on a swing from Labor to Coalition. Every seat could be lined up as safe Labor, safe Coalition, or gradiated in between. And when there was a swing, they tended to be the same all across the country. They tended to be consistent within electorates by polling place. But what's happened since is, in the old days, they would count those primary votes, then count the preferences, and they'd be phoned through to us. Nowadays, there's a lot more votes in that third-party pool. So it takes longer to count them if you've got the right pairing. And if you've got the wrong pairing, so say they pick to count Liberal versus Labor, and it turns out to be Liberal versus an independent, then the Labor-Liberal preference count you get is useless. It doesn't tell you anything. And it takes longer for that to arrive as well. So there's a lot of where there is a big delay now in that more accurate preference count arriving, if it's the right pairing. So that delays the really reliable data till later in the evening. Secondly, we've got bigger pre-poll centres. They come much later in the evening, large numbers of votes. They take longer to count. And because they're not cast on the day, they're cast beforehand, they behave a bit differently than on the day. And it's not consistent from election to election. Sometimes there's a big gap between the major party vote, Labor Party vote. We tend to talk Labor versus non-Labor just in terms of modelling. It's not a political view. It's just historically, that's the way it tends to be. The Labor Party has been there for over 100 years. The coalition has tended to be different names over the years. So we tend to talk Labor, non-Labor. Once upon a time, that swing and variability of Labor, non-Labor used to occur between the primary votes, and that would be reflected in the two candidate preferred. So if Labor's primary vote went down, the coalition's primary vote went up. And that was reflected also in the two candidate preferred. But what's happening nowadays is there's multiple distributions going on in the electorate. It's not just Labor versus Liberal. You may have an independent, and their vote will be different across an electorate. The Green vote will be different across an electorate. And there's a much larger pool of third-party votes. And if they're not flowing as you'd expect previously, it affects your prediction. And then much later in the evening, those pre-poll votes that arrive, which are cast beforehand, sometimes they're more strongly, very strongly towards a coalition, leaning towards a coalition, sometimes less so. But it varies from election to election in a way which doesn't seem to correspond exactly to what's happening on the day. And that's making the whole thing much more difficult. And then you get the issue of, if you've got the wrong pairing, then you can't use a preference count. But what if you've got three candidates with roughly equal votes, and at one point one will be ahead and then another? It means that instead of just picking who's past 50% after preferences, the way we used to do all the mathematics. Nowadays, you've got to look at, well, who's going to finish first and second here? And what's the way to predict who's going to finish first and second? We do information on primary votes. We look at the polling place patterns. But as I said, it's not just one-dimensional in terms of the swing. When I talk about distributions, I mean, I'm talking about a mathematical and normal distribution. There's the distribution of votes across an electorate for, it used to just be Labor and Liberal. They used to be inversely related. Nowadays, as I said, you've got the Greens or you've got Independents, and they've got their own distribution across electorate. So feeding up to the preference count, you've got this difference between Labor and Liberal, but you've also got differences from area to area in these other candidates and their preferences. So the pattern of votes at the top level when you get to two candidate preferred isn't as reliable. The numbers are more variable. They've got a bigger variance over them than they used to have. Now, we use polling places to try and counteract for statistical bias that early figures are not reliable for later. That's being undermined by pre-poll votes because we don't always know what those big final booths coming in are going to look like. But we're also just getting a bigger variance on the numbers, and that just makes it more difficult to build a confidence interval to predict who's winning.
Can I come back to that idea of getting the right pairing to start with? I think it's possible that some of our listeners don't understand this idea of setting up a pairing to start with. I certainly don't. Can you explain that for us a bit?
Okay, historically in Australia, preferences were only ever distributed in seats where a candidate, where no one reached 50% on first preferences. Now, starting in 1984, at the end of the election, he started to do a full preference distribution in every seat. So we had that data available. In 1990, we had a very close election, and we had the Electoral Commission had started to do this work to compare first preference votes. But come election night, we suddenly had 20% of the vote with third parties, much higher than previously, and there were no preferences available. So it was unclear who had won. In fact, at that election, Democrat preferences flowed much more strongly to Labor. The Labor Party actually campaigned and advertised to get those preferences. So that was one of the reasons why there was a shift. So starting in 1993, they started to do what's called an indicative preference count on the night. They count all the votes in a polling place, allocate them to candidates, by count the first preference votes. And then beforehand, they nominate two candidates as the likely final pairing. And they look at all the votes for the other candidates and work out for those other ballot papers which are the final two candidates they go to. And they tally that preference destination, that preference flow data, add it to the primaries and phone that through as a two candidate preferred. It's worked perfectly well for a very long time, but it's getting harder and harder to be certain who the final pairing is. And the Commission has to make that decision beforehand. If you've got 50 polling places in a district and you've got pre-polls and you've got postals, you can't count some of the votes and make the decision. Otherwise, you've got people sat around in polling places all night waiting for everyone to decide what preference counts they should do. You have to nominate it before. There's no way around it. You have to nominate them before. If you pick the wrong pairing, that's it. You'll just do it again in the days after the election. Because after the election, all the ballot papers come in from the polling places. They're all at one central centre. You can actually then count them preferences again, and that's what they do. But you've got to make that decision on the night. And as we saw in South Australia, 2/3 of the decisions they made were wrong. They basically picked Labor versus Liberal in nearly every seat across the state, because historically that's what you've had. And then One Nation finished second in 2/3 of the electorate. So half of those preference counts done between Labor and Liberal were pretty useless for trying to predict Labor versus One Nation. No, it wasn't a close election, so it didn't really impact anything. But it did mean the preference counts we got on the night were wrong, and they were all redone on the Monday and Tuesday after the election. People could say, well, the Commission should have done that. One Nation was polling strongly. Well, One Nation had polled strongly, but they had never actually on election day got those sorts of votes. So they went with the more historic pattern. Now, we're coming up to Victoria later this year, and it's going to be just as wild. Most recent polls have all three parties between 26 and 27%, which makes it very hard to make a decision beforehand. They're going to have to make a decision in every seat who they're going to count to. And to not count towards at least one of the two parties in the previous election, especially if they've got a sitting member, is quite a decision by an electoral commission. I must say these decisions are made in secret. They are not released before 6 p.m. on the night. Some of us sign a secrecy undertaking with the Electoral Commission, so the media with tally rooms tend to have some information on this. And some states don't tell us anymore. But it means that that decision has to be made beforehand, and it has to be kept secret, because if it gets out, people say, a candidate would say, well, there's no point voting for so-and-so, the Commission's not counting preferences to them. I remember a decision, one of those in 2013, which is the election of Indi, where Kath McGowan was the independent who won the seat. And the Commission made the decision to count Liberal Labor, which meant it was useless for us on election night. I remember ringing the Commissioner for Victoria and saying, you've picked the wrong pairing, but it was too late to change. If that decision had been public, the Liberal Party would have been telling voters, there's no voting for the independent, the Commission's not counting preferences. I mean, that's misinformation, because it's irrelevant if they get the wrong pairing and they count them all the next day. So the information has to be kept secret, so that decision, which is just for information purposes, isn't used to influence how voters change. When we vote, it's a preferential voting system. We want voters to list the candidates in the order they would like to see them elected. And that's the basic principle of the electoral system and the counting method. The counting method assumes that the votes you have got are by each of the voters freely choosing to select the candidates in the order they would like to see them elected. And so the least preferred candidates get knocked out and their preferences get distributed and they get the final preferred candidate. That's the basis. Now, I can give you an example of where that's completely breached as a counting method. People remember that old ticket voting system in the upper house where you have the above and the below the line votes. Until recently, it used to be, until 2016 federally, if you voted above the line, your preferences went by the ballot, the lodged ticket of the party. And the parties would do deals. So all the preference tickets, 95% of the votes are under control of these tickets. And the tickets weren't done on the basis of a preferred ordering. They were done on the basis of strategic patterns, alliances, keeping votes with small parties ahead of large parties. And so what happened is if you're counting the votes and you presume that these are in a preferred ordering and actually all the votes are in a strategic ordering, if someone makes a wrong choice in their preference ticket, if you get a very close contest, then a preference decision, which if one candidate was one vote ahead, the preferences would all go off to the right, and if the other candidate was ahead, they'd all go off to the left. So you get completely different outcomes, which wouldn't occur if voters filled in their own preferences, because you wouldn't get such strong patterns. And people remember back in 2013, in WA Senate election, they lost some ballot papers, about 1,200. Now, if voters had filled in the preferences, it wouldn't have mattered. That wasn't enough to change the result. But in fact, because of these tickets, there was a very close call. There were perpendicular preferences going in opposite directions. And a 2 or 3 vote difference changed 2 final seats in that election. And the difference between candidates was 9th and 10th. Now, you couldn't have modelled that. It was it was an unstable system, because the tickets that were involved were strategic. They weren't showing preferences. And that's why you don't normally get that in our system in the lower house where voters fill their own preferences. You do get situations where you've got a 3-way split. You might have a Labor candidate, a Liberal candidate, a Green, for instance. And the Labor Party would preference the Greens would preference Labor, but the Liberals would preference Labor. So you get the situation where the Greens might be first. There was actually, which was the one? There was a case in Brisbane, the 2022 election. The Liberal Party were ahead with the high 30s, and the Greens and Labor were roughly equal, about 29%, and there was about 8 to 10% off with some other candidates. If Labor finished third, the Green would win. If the Green finished third, Labor would win. If they'd been even closer and the LNP had finished third, Labor would have won. So in a close 3-way contest like that, the ordering of the candidates matters. It's not common for that to happen. And preferential voting allows a candidate to come behind. If the Labor and the Green votes coalesce towards each other, that makes sense because they do preference each other. So you're looking at, in that case, the LNP versus Labor and the Greens, and you get the right result because most voters didn't vote for the LNP. But you can get the odd situation where it just is a different result depending on who finishes.
That's wild. I didn't realize how complicated it could be, based on decisions made before the election.
Well, I mean, those decisions are made before the election, but they are indicative counts. They're indicative of the result. If they have picked the wrong pairing, it's all redone on the Monday, and that's how it should be. But it's a difficulty for the Election Commission. They have to make a decision. They don't have any polling data, and the closer the contest, the harder it is to be certain of that polling data. If the South Australian Election Commission had picked One Nation as the second candidate in 20 seats, and it hadn't finished that way, they would look like fools. So the Commission does tend to err on the side of what they have seen before. So if you have a seat where the Greens have done well in the past and they're in race, there's also a decision made if you've got a seat where the Greens are polling strongly and it's like a three-way split, then they may make the decision that they'll pick a pairing, say like Liberal versus Labor, and if the Greens finish second, because those Labor and Green preferences swap, you can still have a rough idea what the result is. It's where you've got a preference for an independent that's come on the scene since the previous election, and you've got no information on how preferences flow to them. That can be difficult if you've got the wrong pairing. A couple of seats in South Australia which were closer as two-party contests, and you really needed to see that second One Nation count to be certain. And in the case of South Australia, I remember there was one seat which One Nation did win. And the One Nation, on election night, the One Nation candidate was first, the Liberal candidate second, and Labor third. And on that basis, you would say Labor preferences would flow to the Liberal and the Liberal would have won. But the minute I was looking at the results on the night, I could see there was one big pre-poll centre to come from Gawler, which is an urban area. It was a mixed rural-urban seat. And I knew from past patterns, and I could see from looking at the comparison of polling places by polling place by party, you could see that when that pre-poll centre would come in, Labor would move ahead of the Liberal. And the Liberal preferences would then elect One Nation. So on the night, the numbers didn't show that Labor would finish in the final pairing and One Nation would win. The numbers we had said the Liberal would win on Labor preferences, but we knew the order of those candidates was almost certain to change when that pre-poll came in. It came in on the Monday, and that proved to be correct. So there's a lot of data you look at, and you set up the data and the polling places history. And just to clarify to people who are listening, we operate on swing. We operate on change in votes since the last election. If you just look at the raw numbers, they will go up and down as the votes come in. But if you operate on swing, the swing from polling place to polling place, which is the change in vote, if you've got a result last time and it's 60% for one party, if you're trying to predict, you don't start from zero. What you operate on is comparing the figure by polling place from last time. So you've got 3 polling places in, and you say, well, the swing is 5%. You can say, well, it was 60 last time, there's a 5% swing against them, so our prediction is 55. That's more accurate than just using the raw numbers, because swing is less biased. It tends to be consistent across polling places, where just the raw polling places, the size of the booth and the Labor, non-Labor vote is correlated. So, a country electorates come in early in the night, so the Labor vote is low, and it rises through the evening. If we operate on swing, that doesn't happen. It's much smaller. And secondly, it's got less bias, it's got smaller variance, so it's a better thing to make your predictor of the final result. But increasingly, as I said, if we haven't got the preference counts, we're having to use other decisions. We can still compare on primaries, so the primaries, the first preference votes and the swing on first preferences will still give us a guide. But if you've got a contest where last time you had Labor and Liberal, and you've got history for both of them, and this time you've got a One Nation candidate coming to the field, if you operate on swing, you've got 2 figures which are matched and one which is a raw number from because they weren't there last time. And that one will have a different variance pattern than the 2 where you've got history. And technically, if you operate on swing and you apply to the swing from last time, your predicted numbers on primaries don't add to 100%. And that's just simply because of the basis of the numbers. It settles down through the evening. When you've got the same pairing of candidates, the swings always match each other on either side and they add to 100%. But when you've got 4 and 5 candidates on primaries, this method of using swings and projecting doesn't always guarantee the projected percentages add to 100%. Some of the numbers are reliable and some of them are not. It's just You just have to know what you're talking about and try and explain it to viewers if you're doing it on television.
So,
So
you
just
talked
to clarify
about.
that, so if I'm coming up to the Victorian election, I can be relatively confident that if I talk about the Labor vote statewide corrected for swing, using swing, I'm relatively confident that that's correct. But the One Nation figure will be all over the place because I don't have any history for it. So the statewide figures won't add to 100%. But that's a modelling issue. It's not an error. It's just you have to be aware of the limitations of the data you're looking at.
Yeah, you have to know how the system works. You've mentioned polling a few times as sort of the opinion polls in advance that give you some idea of how it's going to shape up. What we've seen, it was really obvious in 2016 in the US that the polls were predicting a completely different outcome to the one we got. Do you feel like opinion polls have become less useful or less reliable?
Well, in the case of 2016 in the United States, the issue was people just tend to take the statewide poll, but the election is decided by the Electoral College, by who wins each state and gets all the votes in that state. And there's a series of very close calls at that election. I'm trying to remember the guy who does all this stuff in America. If you did a modelling exercise where you predicted, turn the statewide poll into predictions in each state, and then projected the who would win each state and what the Electoral College would be, if you did modelling, it showed that I think Hillary Clinton had a probability of about 70% of winning. Now, if you use statistical probability, 70% is not good enough. If you are doing something like gambling, and you have something that says 70% chance of knowing that this number will pop up rather than 50-50, and it's a repeatable event, 70% is good enough. If you're gambling, you can bet on a 70% turnout that most of the time you'll get your money back if you keep betting on that. In the old argument about coin tossing, if you got 8 heads in a row, what's the probability of the next one being a head? Well, 50-50. It's just it's the sample space you're talking about. But if you've got a 70-30 split, you can bet on that. But if you're talking an event which is not repeatable, like a presidential election, 70% is not good enough. You need to get into a much higher probability. And so even in 2019 in Australia, when the polls appeared to get it wrong, yes, they did. They were on I think they were all about 51.5 Labor when it turned out to be about 51.5 Liberal. That's just on the edge of the confidence interval, the probability, 95% probability range. So even that wasn't terrible. But the fact that all of them were wrong, there's a great suspicion there's a lot of herding going on there, because opinion polls are not random samples, they're weighted samples. What they tend to report is the error margin for, traditionally they tend to report a probability margin or an error margin for a real random sample. But they're not random samples, they're weighted samples. And when you apply weights, you actually increase the error margin, and nowadays they sometimes report that as well.
How
but
are they weighted samples?
Because they have difficulty getting. Traditionally, it was age, which is always a big variable. But when they do their sample and they look at the types of voters in the sample and reflect the national vote, like university education has always been used as a proxy for education level. There's a number of things like that they do to try and get the sample accurate.
So they try to change the results that they have in the opinion poll to better reflect the population of the country as a whole rather than the population of the sample.
Yeah, when we did phone calls to houses 20 years ago, they did them all on Thursday, Friday, Saturday. It's rather hard to, they would ask questions to randomize who answers the phone. Like, who answers a phone in a house? There's a bias on who answers a phone when it rings in a house. So what they would do, they would ask for the person whose birthday was most recent in the household. Or if they were doing stratified samples, you'd always fill up the sample of voters over the age of 60 when you were polling. It was very hard to get the voters under 30. So as they were doing their sampling, there'd come a point where they'd stop taking anyone over the age of 60 anymore. Because they'd already filled enough of them. So there's lots of things they used to do to try and get the sample good that way. But there was always the issue with phone polling. They were underestimating young people, and they were getting the sort of young people who are home on a Friday and Saturday evening rather than the ones who are going out raving. So I mean, there's things like that. And nowadays, there's very few of them do phone polling. Most of them are operating off samples. There's big samples of people who do surveys, and they do random samples from this big sample, and then they compare it with the population. But they have got better, but there's still a bit of a fudge factor, I think, in some of these polls. And someone produces a poll which is substantially different from everyone else. Someone goes and looks at their sample and goes, "Oh, look, I think we've got too many young people in this sample." Or, they do their best, but I mean, they're just guides. I think they're useful. They give you a rough sample, but I mean, to say you get an opinion poll, which is, the last federal election was interesting. There were plenty of polls showing the Albanese government would lose its majority at the start of the year. There were very few that ever showed the coalition would win. But the ones which showed the coalition ahead were being constantly reinterpreted as the coalition would win. And I don't think that wasn't, as it proved, a correct assessment. In the end, the polls did shift, the public mood shifted as we got closer to the election. So the polls at the start of the year turned out not to be a good guide for what happened on election day. The polls, even as late as the last week of the election, still underestimated the actual result. There's one pollster that got closer, and I think there's some suspicion that some of them just pulled it back a bit.
Yeah. Is there something that you think would be better, or the world would change if more people understood this thing about voting data? Or is there one thing that you think a lot of people misunderstand about voting data that is problematic?
We have a preferential voting system. People, the constant whinge after the election. How did Labor get a landslide victory with only 36% of the vote? Well, it's because we have a preferential system. And that's a nationwide vote. It's 30, 35, 36% nationwide. Labor had two advantages. One, we're a preferential system. They got more preferences, way more. The second one is that Labor's vote was better distributed. Labor polls very poorly in country electorates. It doesn't win. Its vote evaporated in seats it didn't win, or where it finished third or lower and was excluded. But it got a good vote in all the seats it wins. So it was very good, very effective at turning its vote. I mean, even now, I mentioned that opinion poll in Victoria, which had Labor and Liberal on 26 and One Nation on 27. There was also 13% with the Greens. We have a preferential voting system. So Labor on 26, during the distribution of preferences, statewide, it turns out to be more in the low to mid-30s because the Green votes there. There'll be some seats where the Greens will finish in the top two. But essentially, I think in a number of opinion polls at the moment, there's a reporting of the primary votes, which is good, and the two-party preferreds being estimated are rubbish. But when you see an opinion poll, 85% of Green preferences flow to Labor. We know that election after election. So if you add the Labor and the Green vote together, you get something which is a bit more reliable. If you add the Liberal and One Nation vote together, Coalition One Nation vote together, they have preferences for about 70 to 75%. So you can't add them together. You have to discount the fact that there's preferences that leak. So I think there's I don't think the two-party preferred that they used to report is not very useful these days. But if you remember how preferences work, that you can get a bit more information about a poll in the primaries. And I think people should do a little more of that, adding the Labor and Green vote together to see what that looks like, and it's a bit more reliable about what the opinion polls are saying.
That makes sense. It's changed a lot just in the last sort of 10 to 20 years. Do you think it's going to change more?
Well, it depends on the next 2 years, I suspect. I mean, we've seen this real rise of One Nation. Is that a temporary phenomena? I mean, a Victorian election is interesting. If they end up with no party having a clear majority, and the Liberal Party forms government as the one most likely to be able to govern in that parliament, and has to rely on One Nation, the way One Nation behave in the situation where they hold the balance of power for government for 4 years in a parliament, that will impact how people view they can be trusted at the next federal election, for instance. Because there's nothing that exposes a party's ability than actually getting an actual handle on power. it shows whether they're trustworthy or not. So
Yeah.
that will be interesting to see. Because at the moment they're an anti-incumbent party. They're against things. They're feeding on people's resentment that people feel they're working hard and they're not getting anywhere. And there's a real resentment going on. Then some of this flows on from COVID and distrust of government and a lot of conspiracy theory stuff coming out of the United States. That's all feeding in there. We saw at last year's federal election that the Trump stuff seemed to be working for the Liberal Party at the end of 2024. But then once Trump was in power again and was putting tariffs on left, right, and centre, was doing all sorts of strange things, it didn't quite look as safe. And people who are parties that were close to Trump seemed to not do as well. So I think it's an interesting exercise how much American politics is influencing us. Victoria will be a big test. It's the most consequential state election in my lifetime for its implications for federal politics. Because if one nation do well, they get somewhere, they play a role in government. If they're incapable of doing that sensibly, then that will reflect how they're viewed for future elections. Because remember, the party does have a bad record of keeping its MPs in line in Parliament. It's lost a lot of its MPs to the crossbench. A lot of them have been kicked out of the party. If the one nation gets part of the control of the Victorian Parliament and it falls apart, that's a bad sign for the party in the future.
Yep. Speaking as a Victorian, I'd rather not go through that that finding out process.
I also say we've been talking about data. I mean, data shouldn't affect how people vote.
Yeah.
People should, when they vote, number the ballot paper in the order you would like to see the candidate selected. That's voting.
Yep.
I think one of the biggest problems is people try and explain the voting system as a way of trying to explain how to vote, and that's not the way to do it. You vote. It's a preferred voting system. You vote for your preferred candidate, your second preferred candidate, your third preferred candidate. That's what you do. And if everybody does that, the counting system works fine. It's like you haven't listed the candidates in a preferred order. You've listed them in a strategic order to engineer a result. And of course, you're only one of 100,000 votes, so it's a waste of time. Don't vote strategically.
So that's the message. That'll be the key talking point for this podcast. It's a waste of time. Don't vote strategically.
Yeah, I mean, you get some arguments in things like Hare Clark, the proportional representation system, about what's the most effective way to have your vote count. But I mean, people who go in there try and fill in the ballot paper so the ballot paper goes from candidate to candidate to candidate. Wasting your time. You can't pick that. You just vote for the candidates you want elected. Yeah,
that's solid advice. I think it's nicely ethical advice too.
Yes.
Are there misleading stories that the data tells in elections? Are there things that that the data seems to say that don't bear out or that change?
I'm not sure. You thinking of something specific or?
No, I was just I sometimes in my workshops I teach that the story the data tells you isn't, or the story the data seems to tell isn't necessarily accurate, and you have to keep sort of testing and exploring to see if you're actually getting the right idea from the data. We tend to assume that what's in the data is clear and obvious and makes sense, and I just wonder whether there are times when what the data seems to be saying is confusing or misleading in some way.
Well, to some example, I mean, voting is easier than polling. Doing election analysis is easier than polling because your polling places, your results on the night, you treat them as a sample, but the sample keeps getting bigger. The question is, I mean, if you plot a result in an electorate, a two-party preferred line, it might jiggle around and then settle down because it's a progressive count. As your sample gets bigger, it settles down, glides towards the final figure. An electorate, which say a mid-country rural electorate, will start, if you just plot the same graph of Labor vote, it will tend to start low and then rise and then go to the level. At what point does it settle down? We did something like the referendum. We knew that the referendum would start with a low, the voice referendum would start with a low yes vote and it would rise. And so we were plotting it on the night visually because we didn't have real good statistical tools. We could plot, the minute it started to level off, you knew that was it. While I say that, there is one change nowadays, as again, this thing with pre-poll voting, they come in much later and they may behave differently. And as big data spots, they can sort of shift the graph away from the initial trend. because they are a much big lumpier data that comes. And the other thing is, while I draw a nice plot, I always remind people that if you plot the vote received against time, it comes as something that more like a curve which starts off slowly, then speeds up quick, and then levels off. So it's an S shape, an extended S shape. Okay? And that means that all that jiggling around with early figures is occurring over a long period of time when you're trying to figure out what's going on. So often I draw the graph of results on the night. I draw it once with as against the percentage counted, and it looks smoother. And then you draw it against time, and of course there's all that jiggling at the start extends over a longer period, and then the rest of it is flat. So it depends which way you look at the data also.
Thank you so much. This has been a fantastic conversation. I really appreciate you coming back on and sharing your expertise. I think hopefully this will help people understand the voting system better and get some inspiration for what data can tell us and how we can understand it.
Yeah, it's good. I mean, there is more data about Australian elections published than most other countries in the world. And
oh, really? I didn't know that.
The sheer volume of data which is published down to the polling place level is enormous.
Yeah.
That's interesting. And even now, say with the Senate system, the ballot papers are all scanned. So there's actually ballot paper data you can look at nowadays and look at. You can compare it with things like how to vote. Did people follow the how to vote and stuff? That's something which isn't a lot of work done on. But it's interesting. It seems that most people, I always say, from my observation of looking at the data, when people fill in preferences, it's the first, second, third preferences is the most important. If they vote for a minor party, they're likely to go to their eventual destination with a major party at second or third. So that's the most important. There are very few people who go all around the ballot paper before they say put the last two major parties last. So it's always the top of the ballot paper, what people do first, second, and third. And that's got more important as the number of candidates. If you've got 8, 9, 10 candidates, there's a point where people will have 3 or 4 preferences in mind, but the rest of them are just like random. They'll often just end up drifting down the ballot paper. They'll go 1, 2, 3, 4, and then go 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Fill in the rest of the numbers. And you can see that in the distribution of preferences. You can always see this slow drift towards the top of the ballot paper. And when the candidate in number 1 gets excluded, there's always this drift down the ballot paper. You can always what they call a donkey vote. You can always see it. It's not just a donkey vote in terms of the candidate votes 1 at the top and straight down, which is the classic donkey vote. We're increasingly seeing a preferential donkey vote, which is once people have filled in the numbers they know, they tend to go to the top of the ballot paper and just number down, which means that you can sometimes see this drift down the ballot paper.
That's really interesting. It the amount of data that we have, I just assumed that was normal. I didn't realize it was unusual, but I actually used it for a year 10 project with my students back in 2016. It was one of the things that triggered the foundation of my organization, actually, where we just downloaded the Senate votes for Victoria. And so we had this 3 million plus line CSV file, and every line in the file was a vote, and you could see what happened in every box on that ballot paper. And that's just magic. I love, the level of exploration you can do with that kind of data is fascinating.
It only has the formal preferences. The ones which it becomes informal are included. And the second thing is, because it's got both above and below the line ballot papers, if you see one with an above and below the line option, you have to actually sieve it first to figure out which one's formal. I've written code to do it, and it's an absolute pain trying to do it. It's just I've got some lovely tables of the Senate preference flows, and there's something wrong somewhere in my data. I think it's an error of about 1%, which doesn't invalidate my conclusions. It does make it very difficult for me to use precise numbers when I'm down to sort of looking how many ballot papers ended up with the last 2 candidates. It's a bit annoying, but when you've got 3 million records, it's damn difficult to know whether your code's getting every one of them right or not. That's
one of the challenges of working with that scale of data is, how do you verify How do you sense check? How do you spot or detect where things have gone wrong? It's really difficult.
I'll finish with one anecdote. There's a very embarrassing incident in the 2003 New South Wales election where, for reasons which I won't go into, when they do a distribution of someone who's got more than a quota of votes, they have to random sample the ballot papers to determine preferences. Every other state counts them out, but in law, New South Wales says you have to random sample. So they had to program the computer to random sample. So the commissioner was afraid to test the count on the actual data because it didn't necessarily guarantee you get the same result anyway. So he didn't test it. But then there was a problem where in the transfer of votes from the data entry system to the counting system, this is one of these examples of you don't think about what people write on the ballot. People are putting ticks and crosses and stuff, and some of them are formal, some are informal. People would just zero. What do you do with a zero? And anyway, they've got some terrible problem. They've got a muddle between spaces, zeros, and nulls. Anyone who's worked knows what happens when you get a null in a data file. It just stuffs you up. Anyway, so when all the data was transferred from the data entry system to the counting system, and they hit the button to the distribution of preferences, it stopped. And it was this null issue. It's just, I just felt very sorry for them. But if you've ever done any data work, it's very annoying when there's something in your data and you can't find where it's wrong and you spend forever chasing it. And so I've hit that with the Senate data problem. I think I've got it mostly right, but there's something which isn't quite right, but I can't find it.
Well, maybe it's not yours that's not quite right. Maybe it's the AEC.
Yeah. All right.
Thank you so much. That was a fantastic conversation.
Thanks very much.